This is lecture number 4 of the French Revolution series. This is Social Studies 9, and I'm Mr. Banks. So in the last lecture, we talked about the March to Versailles, which women of Paris forced King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette to come back to Paris so that they could witness the bread shortages and the suffering that the peasants were going through. One of the demands was that the king agree to something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So this was passed by the National Assembly, which now is meeting in Paris instead of Versailles. And it's a very important document in the history of democracy. So we learned in the last unit about Magna Carta, or the Great Charter in England. And so this is one of the influences on the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Also, the ideas of the American Revolution influenced this, as well as the philosophers. And by philosophers, I mean the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu. These are all different ideas that influence this document. So a new constitution is developed for France, which was part of the tennis court oath. They made an oath to say that they would keep meeting until they create a constitution. And so this is the result. And the first drafts are prepared by the Marquis de Lafayette, who also had been part of the American Revolution, helping the Americans, and another man named Honore Mirabeau. So they were working together with an American named Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the writers of the American Declaration of Independence. And this document was supposed to give everyone rights, human rights, essentially. The right to liberty, to own property, and to have security. It was going to abolish or get rid of a lot of the rights of the church. And it would have elements that were kind of similar to Magna Carta. So it would outlaw imprisonment without cause. And remember, in the last episode, we talked about the letters de cachet, which allowed people to be imprisoned for no reason. And it would state that people are born free and equal in rights. Just like the American Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal. Of course, the Americans only applied that at that time to white people. They didn't apply it to their slaves, who were not obviously equal at that time. At first, the new assembly, the National Assembly, they wanted voters to just be the people that could vote in elections, to just be men of property. So only men and people that own land. But that wasn't extreme enough for some of the members of the assembly, especially a political party called the Jacobins. And the Jacobins had a part of their party that was even more extreme. And they sat on the left side of the National Assembly. And this is where we get our terms left wing and right wing. So in the National Assembly, the people that sat on the right, they supported the king. They were more conservative. And conservative means that you like tradition. You don't really want change. People on the left side, the farther left they got, the more radical they were. And that, what I mean by radical, is the more they wanted change. So the far left side of the Jacobin party, they were called the Mountain. And the Mountain would eventually take over France. Okay? And so the Mountain at this time in the National Assembly, they're basically saying, this is not extreme enough. We need to have the vote for everyone. We need total equality here. Moving forward. So the revolution is proceeding fairly peacefully by this point, by 1790, 1791. Now, there was the storming of the Bastille, which got violent, but things are changing and reforming, and it seems like everything's going to change for the better. But then this event happens that kind of throws everything out of balance. And it's called in history the Flight to Varennes. But what it was is the escape of the royal family. Okay, so the King Louis XVI, and his family, they planned to leave Paris on April 18th, 1791, and spend Easter in their summer home. But the crowd outside of the Tuileries Palace, where they were staying, they would not let them leave. They sat in their carriage in the courtyard for 2 hours, and the peasants in the courtyard threw stuff at them, hurled insults at them, all sorts of nasty stuff. So this confirmed to the king that the royal family, they were basically being kept prisoner in Paris. Now, in Austria, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was kind of a position that controlled like a lot of Central Europe at the time, his name was Leopold II. And he also happened to be the brother of Marie Antoinette. And he was very invested in restoring the monarchy, restoring the royal family into power, because all the rest of Europe, they all had kingdoms as well. And this removal of the king having absolute power, it threatened all the other kings and queens in Europe. So they wanted to stop this revolution. So the king and queen, Marie Antoinette and Louis, they believed that perhaps they could escape. And they could escape France and go into the Austrian territory, and they would avoid any violence during the revolution. So the king leaves, and once underway, they've got an entourage. They're in the royal carriage, and they're leaving Paris. But they're dressed up not as king and queen, but they're in disguises, trying to avoid the authorities. But they're forced to take a longer route out of Paris than they expected, so it stalls them a bit. And then the king's carriage loses a wheel, and it stalls. And so they have to fix the wheel. And this is on June 21st, 1791. And so they're about 4 hours behind schedule. And they've got people conspiring with them to try to help them get out of France. So the carriage proceeds on its journey until a place called Varennes. And while stopped there, they were identified by the local postmaster. And he recognized King Louis by the coin. So he saw Louis's face, and he looked at a coin in his pocket, and he says, "C'est le roi," it's the king. So they are captured, and this basically kind of destroys the constitution set up by Lafayette and Mirabeau, who they were going to create a constitutional monarchy like England, where the king would share power with the National Assembly. But now that's all thrown out, because now the people are furious at the king. Okay, so I think we covered all this information already in this previous slide. But basically what happens is that the king and queen, they are forced to come back to Paris, and they are forced to come back in disgrace. So the radicals in the National Assembly, and I remember I called them the Mountain, they demand for the abolition of the monarchy. And what that means is a total removal of the king and queen. On the right, the picture here, you have Marquis de Lafayette. And this is a celebration of the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille, which happened in 1789. This was the 1-year anniversary, and at this point, the revolution seemed good. But now, as the king and queen come back to Paris, things are changing, and the government basically says, we will shame these people. As they come back into Paris, we are going to cover the statue of Louis XV, who would be ashamed of the king. We are going to remain totally silent. So thousands of people lined the streets as the king and queen come back in their carriage. and every single one of them is silent. So a very creepy moment for the king and queen. And these people were forced to be silent on the pain of death. So there's a whole thousands of people watching you silently as they come back. So king and queen at this point, they know things are probably not going to end well for them. Okay, so the political clubs. Now, after the Estates General we talked about earlier, France started changing into political clubs, or today we would call them political parties. And the most powerful of these would be the Jacobins. And the Jacobins originally, they were kind of moderate. They supported, as I said earlier, a constitutional monarchy where the king shared power. But the fanatical part of the Jacobins, they wanted now the death of the king. They wanted to execute the king, and they wanted to do it with this invention that was created by a man named Joseph Guillotine called the guillotine. So the guillotine was seen as an egalitarian way of dying, and what that means is an equal way of dying, because in the past, public executions were basically kind of torture. They were really nasty. And with the guillotine, the idea was everyone would be equal in death. Everyone would die in a somewhat humane way. They would just have their head cut off really quickly and they wouldn't feel any of it. So that's the idea with the guillotine. As long as it's working properly, it's a very quick death. So in a weird way, it's kind of part of the Enlightenment, this idea of not torturing people to death, to just giving them a almost more humane death. But I'm not sure if it is so humane in the way it was used, because the guillotine ends up being an instrument of terror. So part of the Jacobin Club was a moderate group called the Girondins, okay? And the Girondins, they wanted just like to kind of copy the English system. But what happened was that events outside of France changed the politics of France. So outside of France, there's a lot of fear. And the fear is over the growing power of the radicals. So, and then by that I mean the Jacobins. So in Austria, in England, in Prussia, and Prussia is today part of would be called East Germany. They're all threatening to invade France because they want to see Louis XVI back on the throne. And Louis XVI at this point has been put into prison. So France is attacked. And during times where people are attacked, times of war, often the politics of the country becomes more radical, more crazy. So France is attacked, but they managed to gather their forces and create not a royal army, but a citizens' army. And the citizens' army actually defeats the invaders. One of the first battles they win is called the Battle of Valmy. And so this gives the revolutionary government of France more confidence. Now, the working class poor in Paris, they're often known as sans-culottes. And what that means is without breeches or without stockings. So they wore trousers, they wore like pants. Most people, upper class in French society at this time, wore stockings. And so they were really a group of people, very poor people, kind of desperate people who were easily manipulated. And they were manipulated by the press, by basically what we would call today propaganda, or some people call fake news. So the leader of the Jacobin press, Jacobin press was spreading a lot of rumor, a lot of propaganda. His name was Jean-Paul Marat, okay? And he's kind of a nasty guy. And so he spread all sorts of rumors to whip up these sans-culottes, to use them for their own purposes, to use them to commit violence for them. So these people, the sans-culottes, they're really susceptible to propaganda and conspiracy theories. Think about today, a lot of people get their conspiracy theories, these ideas that have no actual scientific merit. They get them from YouTube and other places. Well, back in this time, it's from the newspapers, from the Jacobin press. So in 1792, the sans-culottes, the people of Paris are called Parisians. They invade the royal palace, the Tuileries Palace. And the Tuileries Palace is where the king lives and is protected. And the people that protect him are soldiers from Switzerland. So these Swiss soldiers are attacked by the peasants of Paris, the sans-culottes, and they are all killed. And so the king is basically taken into custody. And shortly after this, the poor of Paris, they rise up based on rumors and, again, the press kind of misleading them, and they kill 1,500 people. This is called the September Massacres. And they kill prisoners and they kill priests. So these are like just evidence of how like the common people of Paris can be manipulated, in this case by the Jacobins. And the Jacobins, their goal is to create kind of this system of total equality in France, kind of like an early form of communism, although the ideas of communism don't exist yet, because the guy who came up with the ideas of communism, Karl Marx, hasn't even been born yet. But this is kind of like an early version of that. And they want to create like this cult of equality, but they want to do it through terror. So they're going to use the guillotine, and they're going to use the violence of the sans-culottes. Here is a cartoon from, it's a primary source. It's from the French Revolution, although it's an English cartoon. How can we tell it's English? Well, the writing is in English. And it says at the top, no God, no religion. Then it's got right at the top the hat, the red cap of the revolution, which the revolutionaries used to wear. It says no king to the right now on the top right, and no constitution. And we see two of these sans-culottes people of Paris, really poor. And how are they portrayed? They're drinking blood. They've got cups taking blood off the axes. They've got knives and alcohol in their hands. And they're using the guillotine to basically slice the world in half. And what does the world look like? It's on fire. On the bottom of the page, and it says the radicals' aims, you see a king's crown. You see the hats of bishops or religious. You see the Bible. You see crosses. And you even see, I think, something that says Magna Carta. I could be wrong about that. But basically, they're stepping on all this stuff, showing no respect to religion, to the monarchy, to law. So what is the cartoonist view of this picture, of these people? Well, obviously, this is a really unsympathetic portrayal of these people. And I think the cartoonist believes these people are maniacs. They can't be trusted. And if you give power to the average common peasant, this is what will happen. The world will burn. So it's a view of the French Revolution coming from the English, who don't think that this radical shift in society is a good idea. The British are a little bit more conservative, and they've changed 100 years earlier, as we know, from a absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. And France is on the way to changing to a republic. Here's another particularly nasty British cartoon about the sans-culottes again. And this is a pretty savage depiction of the sans-culottes. But it actually reflects the popular opinions of the late 18th and early 19th century. The working class people in this are shown as violent. And this is right after the September massacres that I talked about earlier. So it's done by an artist named James Gilroy, and it's overstated. It's an exaggeration. You might say a word that you could use is a hyperbole. And it shows kind of the horrific aspect of these September massacres. But it's based on a lot of false reports, a lot of propaganda and fake accounts of what actually happened. There was accounts of cannibalism, like people eating other people, of devil worship. And so this is completely an unfair characterization. It's not true. It's propaganda. It's trying to show the revolution in a really, really bad light. And again, it's British. So is it a trustworthy source? Is this something that really happened? No, it's not. It's somebody's imagination. None of these things happened. But it's particularly shocking and grotesque. So that's why I included it, just because it's interesting. Here's a historian's view on the September massacres. And remember, these happen after the king tries to escape France. Following the September massacres, the vision of revolution put forth by the Jacobins implied that a revolution was often uncontrollable and inherently violent, but simultaneously purposed and constructive. As Robespierre memorably asked in the wake of the massacres, "Do you want a revolution without a revolution?" implying that a revolution necessarily entailed a certain amount of disruption and violence. Mary Ashburn Miller. So what she's saying is that Robespierre, who we're going to talk about in a second, he is going to use these September massacres and kind of imply that you need to have violence. You need to have, to make an omelet, you need to break a few eggs. So he believed that it isn't really a revolution unless some people die. And it kind of ties into those Roman paintings that we looked at earlier, showing the kind of glorifying violence and glorifying the sacrifice of violence and war. So Robespierre really thought this way. So let's figure out who was Maximilien Robespierre. So the leaders of the Mountain, or what became the Jacobin, the radical part of the Jacobin party that actually eventually became the leaders of France. There are Robespierre, another man named Georges Danton, and Jean-Paul Marat, who was the leader of the Jacobin press. So shortly after the September massacres, where the sans-culottes, the peasants, they killed 1,500 prisoners and priests, Robespierre became the leader of the Jacobin party. And he became leader because he was an excellent orator, which means speaker. And he basically believed that Louis XVI was going to have to be executed. So he convinced many people of this, and he said, quote, that Louis XVI must die so that the country may live. So he really believed, Robespierre, that he was some kind of prophet, but he was not religious. So he viewed himself as a prophet of the Enlightenment. So instead of believing in Christianity or another religion, he believed in the Enlightenment, the logic, the reason, and the ideas of the philosophers, especially Rousseau. So instead of having a Bible by his bedside, he had a book by Rousseau. And his idea when he came to power in France was to totally reform the customs of the France, to get rid of all the old ways, get rid of the church, get rid of the monarchy, and get rid of the system of privilege that existed. And he was going to, and some of those ideas we could think of as positive today, but the way Robespierre did them was troubling. And he wanted to create a system of terror in France. And that system was going to be using a secret police. It was going to be using paranoia. And he would do anything that he could to maintain power. So his reign for 3 years, from about 1791 to 1794, is called the Reign of Terror. And I think around about 60,000 people are killed during this time. So he does all sorts of interesting things. He changes the calendar. So he creates something called the French Republican calendar and changes all the names of the month. He abolishes the Catholic religion, and they even destroy churches and pull down statues and all sorts of stuff. Remember how we talked about that idea of iconoclasm? And he establishes something called the Reign of Terror, a system where people would basically find any reason, any talk against the government would be seen as worthy of execution. So we'll talk about that in the next lecture, the Reign of Terror. But I'm going to end it there today, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you.